This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello, my name is Carlo Martuscelli, and I'm a health policy reporter for POLITICO Europe. Today, we're going to be discussing something that seems to be constantly getting closer, but remains seemingly always out of reach. The European Commission's pharmaceutical strategy was planned for the end of this year. The latest news is that it's coming out sometime in the first quarter of the next year. An impact assessment was meant to already be published, but it got delayed after a negative opinion from the Regulatory Scrutiny Board. It's a big deal. It's the first update to the EU's general pharmaceutical legislation in 20 years. The fate of an enormous industry is at stake, as is the budget of the EU's health systems, which are going to come under increasing stress as the continent is hit by an economic crisis, and longer term, as the population grows increasingly older. Is there a way to write the regulation so that innovation and access can both be promoted without bankrupting budgets? Or does it have to be either or? And if that's the case, who's the winners and who's the losers? We'll be discussing all of that now, but first I wanted to give a big thank you to both everyone joining us in the room and to our online audience as well. I'm joined here today by Natalie Moll, Director General for EFPIA, and joining us online we have Deputy Minister of Health for the Czech Republic, Jakub Dvoracek, and we have Ellen Tohen, Director of Medicine, Law and Policy. And I believe Dolores Montserrat, MEP for the EPP, is also going to be joining us, although I think she's not joined us yet. We were supposed to have someone from the European Commission also here, but they pulled out, citing the sensitivity of the file. So you can address your complaints to the European Commission. While we wait for Dolores to join us, just to kick things off, I wanted to go around the table, a couple minutes for each person responding. I wanted to ask you to put yourself in the Commission's shoes and say how you would think about this trade-off between innovation on the one hand and access and affordability on the other hand, and whether you think this is a zero-sum game. So Natalie, we'll start with you since you're in the room. Yeah, a couple minutes. How do you think about trade-offs in the pharma strategy?
Thanks, Carlo. First of all, I would really hope it's not a trade-off. The second thing I would do if I were in those difficult shoes would be take a step back and think to when the origin of the review was thought of. So, making this 20-year-old regulatory framework modern and fit for purpose for the future. Of course, there is a need that we all share to improve access, but fast forward 3 years later, we find ourselves in a completely different world today, right? So this morning we saw Minister Jaško. We heard from other colleagues afterwards. I mean, this is a world, at least in Europe, which is a completely different world from what it was before. And it's a world right now that is suffering energy crisis, huge cost of living increase, and it's shaky. We've learned a lot post-COVID, but it's a region that desperately needs stability and solidity. And I'm delighted to represent an industry that still can represent that for Europe. It's an industry that absorbs the increased energy costs, the increased supply chain costs, because Unlike other industries, we don't increase our prices. And we still are the biggest positive trade balance for the European Union in the tune of hundreds of billions of euros. So I think if I were in those shoes, I would think about, okay, what do I desperately need to fix now to make sure that this industry can flourish and continue to bring new medicines for patients in Europe? How can I improve access? But how can I avoid hurting this industry that we desperately need at European level? So it would be a bit of a new, I think I would do a reset of my mindset and see what I can fix in the legislation and what I can fix outside the legislation.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Natalie. I wanted to hand the question now over to the Deputy Minister. In a sense, you are going to have to be doing this trade-off because the legislation is eventually going to land on your desk in the Council. So how do you think about the trade-off?
I would like to confirm, what Natalie said. I really think it's not the trade-off. And also, when we start to think, how it is with the access in the Europe, I believe, that we have one of the best access, to the modern treatment, in the history, and we have also, one of the best access, compared to the rest of the globe. The only problem, or the main problem, is that this access is not balanced. It's not let's say same all around the Europe. We can see that there are the regions or member states where the access is better. In some countries the access is worse. We see quite a big disproportion in what we considered as a golden standard. So and we can also see it that there is a big discussion or big issue with let's say access to modern treatment, but now we're also facing a number of situations, the disruption of supplies of very basic products and very old pharmaceuticals. So we need to solve both. We need to get the balanced environment which will serve for the already existing old products which are at the European market, but also to have a very balanced access to the new modern technologies. And I want to highlight it, if you really, see how we create, the healthcare environment in Europe and compare it to the rest of the globe, it's very social. We really try to have all around Europe to have a best possible access based on our budgets. Of course, the budgets are limited, and we will have to just probably focus more, what is really innovation. And how we pay for the innovation. If the money, if the reimbursement which we're providing around Europe is it's really worth to added value of new coming pharmaceuticals, but also the medical devices and screening programs. So it's more about to find the good way how to access assess new technologies, how to have a data available, and it's connected, with already existing legislation which we have in pipeline. I'm talking about the European health data space, and as you mentioned it, we have a great opportunity now. I mean, as we can see of the number of further coming to regulation, like the orphan regulation, also the regulation for pediatric use of medicine. There is a really great opportunity, and I just have the feeling, that the current existing proposals are not really reflecting the situation, and we will have to really sit once more with industry, but also with patient organizations, to prepare the environment which will serve all of us, and it will also protect the budgets.
I'm going to pass the question on to Ellen, but before I do that, you mentioned that the existing proposals aren't ideal. I take it you're referring to the draft impact assessment that's been circulating. I wanted to know, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the Czech Republic is at the head of the rotating council presidency. Do you have a feeling of where the other member countries are on this? Do they share the Czech Republic's perspective that you're not very happy with the current Commission proposal?
I think this is still in a quite early stage, so I can't really say how the rest of the states see that. So yeah, I would really not. I'm not ready to address this topic.
Okay, sure thing. Well, Ellen, then over to you. I suspect you're going to say that there is a trade-off. Maybe you're a little less optimistic than what's been said so far. But yeah, please, what's your take on it?
Yeah, good morning, Carlo, and thank you for inviting me, and lovely to be with the others on this panel. Well, I know you're not seeking consensus, but I'm not sure that we should talk in terms of trade-off. For several decades, I've had a T-shirt that said I+A. We wanted both innovation and access, and I think that there's sufficient resources in the system, if they're dealt with carefully, to ensure that to happen. I think key in proposals from the Commission will be to protect the solidarity in Europe, but also make sure that whatever decisions are made, you also look beyond the borders, because if COVID has taught us anything, there's a huge need for greater global solidarity as well. Innovation is incredibly important, but so is the question how to best pay for that innovation. And if you look at the regulations so far, that has always been based on paying for it through high prices. And I think it's questionable whether that is the best way to go forward. The legislation has always been based on the principle that offering exclusive rights to the pharmaceutical industry through a variety of measures. You have patents, you have patent extensions, you have data exclusivity, market exclusivity, orphan exclusivity. Exclusivity is good, more exclusivity is better. That principle is something that needs to be questioned. I think there need to be a greater variety of incentives for innovation. And
okay,
sure
maybe Ellen, just on this question of incentives for innovation, then I want to just jump in and ask you about one specific incentive that's been proposed, which is antimicrobial resistance vouchers. The idea here being that if you develop a drug that maybe isn't so profitable on its own, but is socially necessary, like antimicrobial drugs, you get rewarded by being able to use your exclusivity elsewhere. Now, I know civil society generally hasn't liked this proposal, but at the same time, I think it really illustrates very clearly the kind of trade-offs we're talking about. I mean, the reality is that we haven't had the incentive, and there hasn't been much research into drugs that can bust AMR. So isn't it the case that if we want research to go into drugs we really need, we're going to have to pay for those somehow, maybe at a high price?
As I said, if you want innovation, you need to pay for it, but you need to think carefully about how you pay for it. And if you look at antimicrobial resistance and look at those who are actually involved in the research and the development of new antibiotics, those are not the large companies that are going to benefit from these exclusivity vouchers. Again, these are not the fast track vouchers like were implemented in the United States. This actually is an exclusivity, analogous to a patent that can then be traded. Now, you may be creating a market for those vouchers with that, but you don't necessarily create an innovation market for new antibiotics. So if I was the Commission, I would first look at who is actually involved in this kind of research, who are developing these antibiotics. Those are mostly smaller companies and non-for-profit initiatives, such as GARP, for example, and figure out how much it costs to fund that directly. That may be a much more cost-effective way of moving forward. These transferable exclusivity vouchers are presented as something that doesn't cost anything, but that of course is not true, because at the end of the day, these vouchers will be used by companies for their blockbuster drugs, with which they often have already made billions, and extend that exclusivity. With that, you postpone the entry of generic medicines or biogenerics and biosimilar medicines, and that will come with huge cost to the European healthcare system. While it might be, you might have progress at a much more cost-effective way.
Great. Thanks for that, Ellen. Natalie, I want to flip that question to you now, kind of do the converse. I mean, would you be willing to, well, I guess you're in favor of AMR vouchers, I guess for the reasons that Ellen just illustrated, but do you think that there can be a trade-off in the sense that there's places in the system where fat can be trimmed, so to speak, if you get certain incentives elsewhere? For example, some kind of pullback on IP. I mean, I think the idea of the pharma strategy is a kind of modulation of incentives where maybe overall it's more or less neutral, but you add some in some place, you take away in the other place, and hopefully you get a system that's more socially responsive to our needs.
So those are two questions in one. I'm going to answer the second one first.
Sure.
No, the issue with IP is that IP is a tool to attract investments, right? And investments in our industry are for 10, 15 years. So that's how long it takes to go from 10,000 candidates to one if you're lucky. So the key to IP is that it should be stable and predictable. For any investor looking into this area, they probably don't look at this area because it's really risky, but when they do, they need to know for the next 10, 15 years, 20 years, this is going to hold. This is going to be stable. As soon as you start tweaking, there are other parts of the world where they don't tweak or they tweak up, and that's more attractive. We have to be realistic. Europe doesn't exist in a vacuum. So that's the first thing I would say. Having said that, you know, we ourselves looking into the orphan medicinal product area where we can see in rare diseases we need even more solutions. We're looking at what are we blocking against, and one of the areas is the difficulty in science. Other areas in incentives, can we modulate slightly, but not change the baseline. As soon as you change the baseline, you just make this region even less attractive. We're complicated enough. We have 27 markets. It's hard enough to come to Europe. On AMR and vouchers, we have been looking, I think, collectively for a solution for I don't know how long, right? And the inaction is just an impossible concept at the moment. And when I look at the 400,000 people dying every year in Europe because of antimicrobial resistance, you think, okay, there's just no way. We just can't sit here and do nothing. And collectively, we've looked for solutions. We have an opportunity now with the European revision to have a European solution that has no upfront cost. So you're perfectly right, Ellen. There is a cost, but not an upfront cost. It's a European level solution. It's pro-stewardship because it's not dependent on how many products you sell. And it's something that can help not only large companies, but small companies. Small companies can trade those vouchers. Even research institutes can use those vouchers. So you're basically incentivizing that level of research in a stable and predictable way. And what I like about the proposal is that you can modulate the voucher depending on the benefit that the antibiotic brings to society. So it's not a fixed voucher, it's not for a fixed amount of time, it's between 9 and 12 months. It's in that first year of loss of exclusivity when anyway you have generics and innovators at the market at the same time. So we calculated that basically the cost-benefit ratio, for example, say for Italy, because I had to do that recently, was 10 to 1. So the benefit cost was 10 to 1. And you're saving 11,000 people dying in Italy every year of antimicrobial infection. So I think, you know, it's time to do something. We have an opportunity with the European revision. As an industry, we set up the fund until the end of this year to get 2 to 4 antibiotics, but that's like a little bridge. We need something more sustainable, more predictable, more attractive, and this for me is a viable option together with many others. It's not the only solution, by the way.
Great. We'll be returning to the topic of incentives, but before we do that, Deputy Minister, one of the proposals that's being discussed is giving companies that launch in all 27 EU markets an IP extension, and that's but you move the baseline down. The Czech Republic is one of the countries that, in theory, would benefit. It's a small market, and pharmaceutical companies might not prioritize it as much as larger ones like Germany or France. What do you think of this proposal?
I think this is quite a complicated topic because of course, at the first look, you know, the incentives, you know, just telling, okay, we will incentivize you at the moment. You will launch, you know, in certain time in all European countries. could look like a good way. But where we see the main problem, especially in the smaller and small countries in Europe, is that the number of those innovations which we are talking about, and especially in the area of rare disease, it's not a big companies. It's not the big pharma. Very often, it's small biotech companies which have a very limited capacity in let's say, administration to really prepare the launch, to prepare the file, for the application to get the reimbursement. So practically, it's a question mark. How those things will look like. So what's coming to my mind, when I think about this situation, and we already have, in the legislation, in the European legislation, the duty of the marketing authorization holder to provide the information when and how the launches in the member states will look like. What we need to probably to get to the system, what will happen, in the time between. So to be precise, if I take the situation, the small company launching the new innovative product in Germany, in France, as a first wave of countries, and then to see the plan of those companies, to launch it in the small countries, Baltic CE countries, year and a half or maybe 2 years, after this first wave of launches, then we will need to create some kind of bridge, how those pharmaceuticals will be available for the patients during the time, and how the smaller markets can also benefit, from the centralized registration and the presence of the marketing authorization holder at the European market. So it's not just about the big companies, but we also have to think, how to bridge the situation for the smaller companies who have absolutely no real capacity to do it. So those incentives will probably not serve for them.
I find this idea of a bridge very interesting, and I'd like to learn more about it maybe later so we can return to that. But I just wanted to say hi to Dolores, who I see is online and has joined us. Dolores, I'm going to come to you soon, but before I do that, I did want to give Ellen a chance to respond to this marketing launch obligation idea that you'd get some kind of reward if you launch in all 27 EU markets. Do you think it's a good idea to incentivize access? And what do you make of some of the problems that the Deputy Minister brought up, for example, small companies not being able to launch, say, in Latvia or Estonia because they're small, they might not have the kind of manpower to reach all 27 EU markets?
Yeah. Well, we have the EU single market, and the pharmaceutical industry benefits from a wide array of incentives because of that. The current pharmaceutical legislation was very much based on the need to create a single market. So I'm a little surprised that they would now be asking for additional incentives to launch in every country. I think that actually should come with. That should come as an obligation for obtaining a marketing authorization, and it is a problem if a company has a marketing authorization and does not and refuses to make a product available. Now, I also recognize the problems that the Deputy Minister just discussed for smaller companies. I don't think this is an issue for large companies. For them, it's a choice to not launch in smaller markets. But for smaller companies, that might be a problem. And solutions would have to be found for that, and that could be in the area of collaboration with other companies that may have that capacity, for example, or some additional assistance. But that would probably, the exclusivity would probably not help those smaller companies in that sense. But I think, again, this all comes back to the discussion of incentives, and actually a key question which we haven't touched upon, and that is, when is enough enough? I'm not against incentives, but I am not in favor of incentives without checking regularly whether some level of sufficiency has been reached. And we've been arguing for the introduction of a sufficiency principle in the European pharmaceutical legislation, where you check in once in a while whether perhaps the incentives hasn't lasted long enough, instead of having one size fits all in incentives. That would, of course, require the other elephant in the room, much greater transparency and much greater sharing of data and information, in particular with regard to R&D cost. But I think it's crucial to have both a sufficiency principle and greater transparency.
Ellen, we're going to return to the point on transparency later soon. But before we do that, I did want to bring in Dolores, who is coming here representing the European Parliament. Now, Doris, it might be after the next European elections, but the Parliament is going to have a say on the legislative proposal when it comes out. You were the rapporteur for the report on the Pharma strategy that kind of set the tone for this upcoming legislation. First of all, has your thinking changed at all since you wrote that report? And what are your priorities going to be as an MEP, and what are the EPP's priorities overall for the legislation?
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I'm so sorry because I arrived a little bit late because I had another event here in the European Parliament. Look, I really believe that the pharmaceutical strategy that we approved in the plenary almost 1 year ago is one of the most relevant and complete programmatic document that Europe has had in the last 20 years. And I say that not just because I was the rapporteur in the European Union, in the European Parliament, because we need to find an equilibrium and build bridges between the medical needs and the prosperity of the industry. We need a competitiveness industry, and more after the COVID, as well as the economic sustainability of the healthcare systems. We have 27 national healthcare systems, and we need these 3 points that are the balance and the equilibrium. No? So access to the patients, so these medical needs, then competitiveness in our industry. We need more research, more innovation, the best treatments for the patients with this power and competitiveness industry. And third, of course, we want our national health systems to be sustainable. Why? Because we want this universal access to all the patients. So this pharmaceutical legislation that, in the next days, month, in this month, we are going to see this pharmaceutical legislation arriving to the Parliament. I hope so that it's achieving these 3 objectives that we put in the pharmaceutical strategy. For me, it's very important: patients, industry, and sustainability of the health national systems.
Thanks so much for that, Doris. I want to ask the Deputy Minister something that you just mentioned now, which is the international element of this. And Heike also mentioned this. How do you think about this legislation in terms of Europe's position vis-a-vis the US, China, Japan, all the other major players in the world of pharmaceuticals?
Well, now we have a big opportunity. That this opportunity gives the COVID. I know that the COVID was a big disaster for all the European citizens. A lot of people died, but the COVID gives us a lot of lessons. The first lesson is that the European Union has to have more competence, more legislation. We have to lead from the European Union the harmonization of the response on health, by European Union. So this is the reason that we create in a record time the European Union for Health. as we have the European Union for the bank, for the finance, for the money. So I think so that this is now it's a big opportunity. Starts a decade with a lot of opportunities for our patients, that at the end it's our citizens, because all of us, we are patients. So not just the European Union now it's leading the climate change fight. I think so that now we have a big opportunity to lead, not just in Europe, in the world, to have the best innovation, the best research, the best competitiveness industry. And one thing that China and the States, they don't have, is the universal health public systems that we have in all Europe. And I think so that this universal gives access, no borders, to get to the public health for all the European citizens, to have the best treatments and more innovative treatments for all patients. So
Perfect.
I'm one of the believers. I'm a believer of the European Union for Health, that inside of this European Union for Health, we already put a lot of tools. The first tool is the vaccines platform. But we have the pharmaceutical strategy.
I'd like to get the deputy minister's perspective now on that same question, on the international element of the pharmaceutical legislation.
No, thank you. Of course, I think it's not far. What was already mentioned. We could play in the future the important role in the research and in the production of pharmaceutical innovation and the medical innovation itself. But if we talk about the competitiveness of the European Union and the Europe in the area of generic products and let's say biosimilars, it's also a different question. And I remember the report of FDA, which covers this situation. It's updated also quite regularly, and it's probably impossible if we will not create something artificial. We can, on one side, create the environment which supports the innovation and production of with highly added value pharmaceuticals. But if you ask me, if we can for a long time could compete with the generic products, and if we could have a full production of those pharmaceuticals in the Europe, it's probably impossible. We have to really choose, what we want to play, the role we want to play, in this area, and to also think, how we will pay for the robust supply chains, how we will pay for the already generified products, and
I will warn that we have representatives of the generics industry in the room, so watch out what you say. Ellen, I wanted to go over to you. I want to return to that issue of transparency, because I think it links up with the international element of the discussion. Before the pandemic, there seemed to be momentum gathering on the question of transparency in pharmaceutical prices and R&D. Do you think that momentum is dead, and do you think the legislation could provide any positive examples for the rest of the world?
Well, I hope it will, but I would like to come back to one thing that Dolores said when she drew attention to the fact which sets Europe apart from China and North America, rather United States, rather, that we have universal healthcare systems, and I think protecting that and making sure that solidarity within those systems can be maintained is very important, and for that, affordability of healthcare products is very important, because there's no denying that there's enormous pressure on national healthcare budgets because of the very high prices. And if you look at some of the newer treatments that come with astronomical prices, that can really not be defended. And when there is, and here I come to your transparency theme, when there is greater transparency, you can come to much more realistic estimates of what a fair price would be. And a fair price is a price that can be afforded by the communities, by the healthcare system, and delivers sufficient profitability for the pharmaceutical industry. But we need greater transparency in order to have a better informed debate, and also better research into those questions. Now, the theme of transparency was, of course, high on and actually still is high on the agenda of the World Health Assembly, when in 2019 it adopted the transparency resolution, which called for greater transparency of pricing, but also greater transparency for the cost of R&D. Some countries have made progress, including in Europe, in implementing that resolution. We saw a lot of transparency go out of the window around COVID, and particularly the procurement of COVID-19 vaccines, these procurement contracts that were dripping with black ink. But at the same time, you also see a renewed discussion about, is this really the best way forward? And how can we ensure greater transparency in the system? I think it's particularly important in the area of vaccines, where you at the same time see a lot of vaccine hesitancy. There's so much nonsense about vaccines going around, that where you can increase the transparency, I think it will only have positive effects, and certainly in creating more confidence in the products as well.
Well, thanks so much for that, Ellen. We're getting near the end of our discussion, and we're going to enter into the Q&A part of it. But before we do that, I wanted to come back to you, Natalie. You kicked off our discussions. You know, I know it's maybe not something that you're allowed to say, but I think maybe you think it. Do we really need to change the system? I mean, or is it a case of, if it's not broken, don't fix it? We've been discussing all the different policy options, the transparency, the international dimension, MR vouchers, but do we risk kind of tampering with something that maybe we should leave, at least for now, and maybe come back to in 10 more years?
So I think going back to the very beginning of the day-to-day, certainly we are in a different moment of life than we were 3 years ago when we did the Pharma strategy, right? So what I would love is for people to take that global perspective into mind, and that the suffering of healthcare systems due to COVID, but not just. Now, the impact of the war in Ukraine on healthcare systems, but also on individuals. Take that step out, look at the review and say, okay, what do I absolutely need to do now to make sure that this industry delivers for patients? And what is it that I can do outside the legislative review, which usually takes a number of years and I have to do now, which is increase access? And what is it that I mustn't do because we are going to lose this industry? And this is really what I would love to have as a reflection. I think the Deputy Minister mentioned it as well. Okay, can we take a serious look? Because those member states are in a particular situation. Europe is in a difficult situation. This is an industry that allows to absorb the energy costs, the supply chain costs that most other industries don't. They pass on those costs to consumers, and it still supports the economy in an enormous amount, but most importantly provides solutions, right? So we have 8,000 medicines in the pipeline. When we had COVID, we had vaccines in Europe. We didn't have to wait for anybody to hand out the vaccines to us. India shut down the exports of vaccines. COVAX didn't get vaccines because India decided, I can't, I'm going to keep it here. So it's really important that the changes that we propose, for example, updating the regulatory framework, making it future-proof, yes. Looking for areas of incentives where we need them, AMR, God, yes, let's move now. Access, let's work on something a little bit faster, a little bit more predictable, a little bit more efficient. Solutions, we've come forward with some actions. They're not the panacea, but it's a start. Let's build on those. Let's work together now rather than wait until the end of the legislation. So I think we just need to take a step back, look in and go, okay, what do I do now? How do I do it? Do I use regulation? Do I do it outside? And get it right.
Perfect. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank everyone that joined us online. Now we're moving into the Q&A, which is only in this room. So please stay seated. And I think we're about to begin just now.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.